I lots of stuff to cover today. I mean, it just keep on going and going and going. But for now, I have with me Skyping Matt Walsh, a popular blogger from The Blaze. He's a speaker, host of the Matt Walsh podcast, and author of The Unholy Trinity, Blocking the Left's Assault on Life, Marriage, and Gender. Matt, good morning, sir. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I appreciate you being here. Before we get to your book, Matt, how would you grade President Trump right now? What would you say about what's going on with him?
I think there's been positives and negatives to it. I think his Supreme Court, so far, I'll say his Supreme Court nominee has been an A+. Although you never know with these things until they actually get in there, right? But I like that, and a lot of the appointments he's made. I'm a big fan of, in particular, how he's pulled back Obama's radical transgender agenda in the schools and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So we have this window of opportunity for the next 2 to 4 years to advance, finally, for the first time in a while, to advance some really important conservative policy points and pieces of the agenda. And I think we've moved in a lot of ways in that direction. But look, I'm not one of those. I'm never a fan of a politician. Like I might support some of them, but I'm never a fan.
Right.
And so I never get to the point where I'm going to agree with everything that a politician does. And I think we need to always be critical of those in power, no matter who they are, if they're R or D. And there are aspects of Trump that I'm not a fan of. Like, for instance, the constant tweeting and that sort of thing. I just don't. I don't think there's a place for that. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it helps the agenda at all. I think it undermines it. So if we could get rid of that and stick to the really great appointments and policies and that kind of thing, then I think we'll be in a really good spot.
I'm real happy about the tweeting because it's clear that he can't and we can't trust the liberal media. And so if he was not tweeting out what was going on, we wouldn't know what the real truth is. And so my question is, if he doesn't tweet, how would you know what that truth is or what's really going on?
Well, there's a couple things I would say to that. First of all, he has other ways. He's the president, so he's got other ways of communicating with the people. He's got many different arms of communication that he can use. And by the way, he's got an entire network, Fox News, the most powerful cable network, that is very inviting of his message and his agenda. So I don't know that Twitter is necessary for that. Twitter's also, it's not an effective communication form because you can only tweet, you can only speak at 140 characters. Many of the issues that you deal with as president require more than 140 characters. And the other thing is that much of what he tweets is not relevant. It's not information that we need. For instance, complaining about The Apprentice or making fun of, of Arnold Schwarzenegger. That's not, we don't care. I mean, that doesn't, we don't need to know that. That's a personal beef that he has that I wish he would put to the side because I don't think it helps the American people. I'm not saying he should never tweet. I mean, it can be an effective thing. But I guess maybe it's more accurate to say what he concentrates on Twitter tends to distract from the more important items on the agenda. And so I wish that we would, because we don't have a lot of time. So we may only have 2 years, really, because we don't know what's going to happen in the midterms. So we have to be dead set and just focused. And getting lost in the weeds on things like The Apprentice and that sort of thing, I don't know if it helps us.
Matt, you are a Christian, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Very interesting book. In your book, The Unholy Trinity, you say Lucifer was the first liberal. Explain that to us.
Yeah. Well, I wasn't just attempting to insult liberals there, although I guess I'm not complimenting them by comparing them to Lucifer. My point is that whatever you want to say about liberalism, you want to trace it back through the last few centuries. Putting that to the side, let's look at what modern liberalism is today. And what modern liberalism is today is the worship of self. It is when you place yourself at the highest point in the universe. You reject objective truth, objective reality, moral truth, scientific truth, as we've seen with the transgender stuff recently, and you make everything relative to yourself. So all true, you have your own truth, your own morality, and everything is relative to you. So it's this kind of self-worship. And that's, by the way, what Satanism is. If you talk to a Satanist, they'll tell you, well, we don't worship Satan. We worship the self. We worship ourselves.
Yeah.
And I would argue that that is what defines modern liberalism.
And not only do you say liberalism is the worship of self, you said that it's in the churches, schools, homes, and on TV. Give me an example of it being in the churches.
Well, I wish I could narrow it down. I wish I had enough time to list all the examples of the churches promoting the worship of self. But I think you find this in many churches that look, either they are in many cases failing to address this heresy that's so rampant in our culture, failing to meet head on the attacks on life, marriage, and gender, which is what the churches should be doing. But so many churches don't even try, and they fail in that regard, and they've surrendered. And then you have churches that have embraced the attacks on life, marriage, and gender wholeheartedly, and will announce them from the pulpit. I've seen story. I read a story recently. In the most extreme examples, I read a story recently about a Episcopal church that had sent its pastors to go perform a blessing on an abortion clinic. Blessing the abortion clinic. Now, it's one, if you want to send pastors out to perform an exorcism at an abortion clinic, I think that's great.
That's right.
But they're blessing, abortion. And so, this satanic agenda has infected many of our churches, and there are many churches that are not churches of Christ at all, but are churches of Satan, essentially, because they do not submit themselves to Christ's law. They submit themselves to man's law.
I noticed that, and I agree with you that it has gotten into the churches. Do you know why that happened? How did it get in? Because, when I was growing up, men were men and boys were boys, this would not have happened. How did liberalism or secularism get into the church?
Well, I think it was a long process that began. Well, if you really want to trace it back, when did this worship of self first appear on the scene? It appeared in the garden, with Adam and Eve. So it's been a long time in the making. But especially in our culture, I think if you go back 40 or 50 years, when you begin to see the collapse of the family, and we know that the family is the domestic church, and the family is supposed to reflect the church and operate like the church, as we're told in Ephesians 5, that's how marriages are supposed to operate. So once the family starts to collapse, I think you see everything else kind of crumble with it. In particular, the churches, because if you don't have a strong families raising kids in the faith, in a strong and true faith, then eventually the churches are going to suffer.
It's interesting that you have written this book. How is this book being received? How are you being treated? Because it's absolutely true in what you're saying. How are you being treated as a result of writing this?
Well, as you could expect, anytime I talk about these issues, the left and liberals are not fans of it. And so you're always going to get the hate from them. And as you well know, so I'm used to that. It barely even phases me. But what I have noticed is, listen, there are a great many conservative radio shows and TV shows and things that are usually eager to have on young conservative authors who want nothing to do with me or this book, don't want to go near it. They don't want to touch the subjects. And I've been told that behind the scenes in many cases. Like, listen, I agree with what you're saying, but I don't want to go near this.
Yeah.
So that's what it kind of upsets me. With the liberals, you expect it. But when you see with conservatives how they're so afraid to talk about these cultural issues, not in all cases, but in many,
right,
I think that's what disappoints me.
I often wonder, what do the conservatives who have this type of fear, what do they expect to happen if they are afraid to fight liberalism with truth? What kind of outcome are they expecting? Because the more fear they have, the more liberals are going to push on them and take away.
Yeah. I think I often wonder the same thing. First of all, what are they going to do to you? What are you afraid of?
Yeah.
They have no power over you.
Right.
They could send you nasty emails and mean comments on Facebook, but that doesn't amount to much. So they don't really have a lot of power over you. There's nothing to be worried about. I think one of the problems we have with some conservatives, particularly the more establishment kind of Republicans, one issue is not only are they afraid of these issues, but they don't agree with us on these issues. They don't care about them, and they just don't. They're basically liberal on these kind of what they would call social issues, and so they don't agree. And they look at us when we talk about the sanctity of life or marriage or gender, and they look at us like we're nutcases and radicals, and they kind of condescend to us.
Yeah.
And they barely even try to hide it. So
I do hear them saying, don't focus on social issues. I hear that a lot on the conservative side. You're right about that.
yeah, and I think that is completely wrong-headed and foolish. It's stupid is what it is. It's a stupid point of view and position. Liberals, you'll never hear liberals say that. When have you ever heard a liberal say, well, these are distractions, let's not talk about gay rights and abortion rights and
Right.
transgender rights? They never say that.
That's right.
Because they realize that, number one, we've abandoned these battlefields so that they've just won everything. And they know that culture is what drives everything else. Culture drives politics. Culture drives the country.
Let me take a quick break, Matt.
Politics are downstream from culture. So they realize that.
Matt,
and unfortunately, a lot of us on our side don't.
Let me take a break. Back in a moment, folks. All right, folks, welcome back. I'm talking with Matt Walsh. His book is The Unholy Trinity, Blocking the Left Assault on Life, Marriage, and Gender. Matt, how can people get your book?
Well, it should be in most of the books. If you go to Barnes & Noble, you should be able to find it there. But, of course, Amazon, I guess is how most people buy books these days. So just go and search for my name or the book there. You should be able to find it.
You, in Chapter 2, you write about the High Sacrament. What is the High Sacrament?
Yeah, the High Sacrament of liberalism is abortion. It is the centerpiece of their agenda. It's kind of what it all began with. And I think the reason, and anyone that doubts that abortion is sacred to liberals, just look at what happens when you go after it. Look at what's happening to David Daleiden and the Center for Medical Progress. I mean, this is actual political persecution. This is stifling of the press happening in California. So for all of this complaining that we hear about how Trump is attacking the press when he, says something mean about them on Twitter, this is actual targeting of the press and of journalists. And why is that happening? Because Dave Daleiden and the Center for Medical Progress went after Planned Parenthood, and you just cannot do that. They will come after you if you do that and try to destroy you. And I think the reason for that is that look at the power they've given themselves with abortion. They've given themselves power over life and death. They've given themselves the power to strip humanity from a certain portion of the population, to say that a baby's humanity is relative to how the mother feels about the baby or how convenient the baby is to those around it. That's an incredible power, and I think that's why they will do everything in their power to protect it.
So David is talking about charging the folks who went into Planned Parenthood and took footage. I mean, they are talking about charging David with a crime, right?
Right.
Oh,
Yeah, David Daleiden, these were the guys that a few years ago went into Planned Parenthood, took a bunch of undercover video of Planned Parenthood officials high up the ladder who were discussing selling the parts of aborted babies. Not only that, but also babies being alive after abortions and then killed and harvested for parts. This is gruesome, terrible stuff. Caught on video, hundreds of hours of video. And not only has Planned Parenthood faced no charges for these many crimes, but now the people who took the video are being charged because they're claiming that, well, you can't record someone without their knowledge. Well, if that's the case, then that means that undercover journalism is illegal, which I've never heard that, but only now, all of a sudden, is undercover journalism illegal because of who the journalist is and who they're going after.
Do you feel hopeful that good will defeat evil? You're a young man. How are you feeling about all this at this point?
Well, I'll tell you where my hope is. I know that ultimately good will defeat evil because, as I say in my book, we've kind of peeked ahead and looked at the last page, haven't we? We've got the spoiler warning. We know how this whole thing plays out, and that Christ will return and good will vanquish evil, and there will be only light and no darkness. So we know all that in the long run. Well, I don't know how long We don't know how long we have. It could be tomorrow. It could be 1,000 years. But in the meantime, it's going to continue to be a struggle. And there's never going to be a moment. There's not going to be a utopia on Earth. There's never going to be a moment where the good guys have just won and that's it. There's going to be a constant struggle. But that doesn't mean that we can't improve things in the short term, especially for our children's sake. Right. And I think that's what we need to fight for. But we have to be on board for the fact that this is a generational struggle. We lost the culture over the course of generations. It didn't just happen with my generation. Didn't happen with my parents' generation. It happened over a course of generations. If we're going to reclaim it, it's going to take generations, and that's going to be a victory, if you want to call it that may be 70 or 80 years in the future that you and I will never see. But we need to fight for that for the sake of our kids.
How have you managed to hold on to your values? You seem to be educated. I know you're out there, you're dealing with these things. How you manage to hold on to your values? A lot of young people are not holding on to them.
Well, I can't pretend that I'm the crowning example of someone holding on to their values. It's a struggle for me, and I've failed many times. I'm a sinful, weak person. I've failed more times than I can possibly count. The only thing that what I lean on and rely on is the forgiveness, the mercy of God, the eternal mercy of God. And so I know that I'm just scratching and clawing my way through and fighting off the devil every step of the way. And I know that when I fail, I can always turn back to Christ. And I also know that what people say, what the world says, doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
And Christ told us that we're going to be hated by the world.
Yeah.
So the more hated we are by them, we know it's a pretty good indication that we're on the right path. And what is there to be, let's say that I abandon my faith and I go try to make friends with the world. What's the point of that? I know I've lost my soul. And in the meantime, am I going to be happy? Am I going to feel fulfilled? No, I'll just feel these people out there in the world who've given up on God. They're not happy. They're depressed.
Yeah.
They're just kind of wandering around. So I know that. And so in some ways it should be pretty easy to just stick with Christ. But we know because we're so weak and sinful, sometimes it isn't. So we're always coming back and always asking for forgiveness. And we know that we'll receive it.
Matt Walsh is my guest, folks. I really urge you to get this book, The Unholy Trinity, Blocking the Left Assault on Life, Marriage, and Gender. Matt, I really wish you well with this book. I think everybody and their mama need to read it, and especially young folks. So I really wish you well, and anytime there's something you want to promote, let us know.
I really appreciate that. Thanks for having me on, and I appreciate your support. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome. Have a good day now.
You too.
All right. Amazing stuff, folks. Check it out, The Unholy Trinity, Blocking the Left Assault on Life, Marriage, and Gender by Matt Walsh. All right. A very, very interesting book, especially coming from a young man. We don't, I do know some young men now, especially since running Bond, who, living upright. They're not afraid to stand up. They're not afraid to fight. But it's hard to find a lot of young folks who are doing that today. So I urge you to get The Unholy Trinity. All right.